Welcome back, everyone. Ready for another deep dive?
Always.
Awesome. Today, we're going to tackle how mental illness gets portrayed in, like books, movies, TV shows, all that fictional stuff.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. And to help us unpack all this, we've got this really insightful essay from a YouTube creator called Hello Future Me.
Okay.
And get this, he's also a trained youth counselor. So he's coming at this from like a storytelling angle and a mental health perspective, which is super cool.
That is a really interesting combination. I'm intrigued.
Right. Okay, so think about it. Have you ever watched a movie or read a book dealing with like depression or anxiety or anything like that, and you just had this feeling like, something feels a bit off here?
All the time. Yeah, it happens a lot.
Yes. Okay, that's exactly what we're going to dig into today.
Love it. Let's dive in.
All right. So the essay starts by pointing out how stories about mental illness kind of have this double-edged audience.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah, you've got people who might be totally new to these topics, right? Like they're learning about mental health challenges for the first time through a character or a storyline.
Okay. Yeah, makes sense.
But then there's the other side of the coin, the people who are living with these struggles every single day.
Right. For them, it's personal.
Exactly. And for them, these portrayals can be like super intense. They can hit really close to home and not always in a good way. Like the essay uses this example of Saving Private Ryan.
Oh, wow. Okay.
The movie,
Yeah.
it got tons of praise for its like raw and realistic depiction of war trauma. It even sparked all these important conversations about PTSD, right?
Yeah, definitely a powerful film.
But here's the thing, those battle scenes, they were so realistic that there were reports of veterans actually experiencing PTSD symptoms triggered by the movie.
Wow, I can see how that could happen.
Yeah, it was so intense that it led to this huge spike in calls to VA support lines. So it really makes you think about the power of storytelling. And like even with the best intentions, art can have unintended consequences, especially when you're dealing with sensitive topics like mental health,
Yeah. Such a delicate balance, isn't it? Creating something powerful and moving, but also being mindful of the potential impact it could have.
Right. It's a lot to consider. Have you ever felt that way about a story, like where it really impacted you, maybe in a way you didn't expect because of how it handled mental health?
Definitely. I think anyone who's engaged with art on any level has probably had that experience. Where a book or a movie just hits you in a really personal way.
Yeah, it can be so powerful. And sometimes it's hard to even articulate why a particular story affects us so deeply. But it's clear that these portrayals of mental health can have a real ripple effect on how we understand these issues, both personally and as a society.
Absolutely. They shape our perceptions, our empathy, our understanding of what it means to live with these challenges. And that's a lot of responsibility for storytellers to carry.
So true. Okay, but you know what else is a perfect example of this?
It's that.
13 Reasons Why.
Oh, yeah.
That Netflix series. I mean, talk about a show that sparked a ton of controversy.
Yeah, for sure. It definitely got people talking.
Big time. Remember all the backlash it got? It was mostly over how graphic it was in depicting suicide, and people were really worried about the influence it might have on vulnerable viewers, especially teenagers.
I remember that. It was a huge conversation.
It was. And there was one line in particular that everyone got stuck on. Do you remember what it was?
I think so. It was. Suicide is for the weak, right?
Yes, that's the one.
Oh.
Ugh, that line just rubbed so many people the wrong way, and for good reason. It was just so dismissive.
Yeah.
What was your reaction when you heard that line?
Oh, my gut reaction. It was pretty visceral. Whoa, that's a really loaded statement. And honestly, I think it deserved the criticism it got.
Totally agree. It was hurtful, and it just fed into all these harmful stereotypes about suicide.
Yeah, absolutely. It oversimplified something incredibly complex and painful.
Exactly.
But what's interesting? The essay actually uses that line, as problematic as it is, to highlight a really complex reality for some people who struggle with self-harm. It's that'd be hard to hear, but the essay argues that for some people, self-harm can actually be a way to avoid suicide. It's like a last-ditch coping mechanism.
That's a really tough concept to wrap your head around,
Right.
especially if you've never personally experienced that level of despair.
Right. And of course, it's not about justifying self-harm or glorifying it in any way. But if we want to really support people who are struggling, it's crucial to understand the really complex motivations behind it. It's not always straightforward.
It makes you realize how much we don't know sometimes,
Right.
and how important it is to approach these topics with sensitivity and a willingness to learn.
Exactly. And that's where this idea of buy-in comes in. The essay talks about how, for therapy to actually work, The person needs to believe that recovery is possible. They need to see that there's a path forward, even when they're feeling completely lost in their own thoughts and emotions.
That makes sense. If you don't believe things can get better, why would you even try?
Exactly. And that's where stories can play such a powerful role. Because if a story portrays these really tough realities authentically, it can make the characters feel more relatable to people who are going through similar things.
It's like seeing yourself reflected in a story can make you feel less alone, less like there's something wrong with you.
Right. And the essay uses John Green's Turtles All the Way Down as a great example of
Oh,
this.
I loved that book.
Me too. It's so good. And the main character, Azah, she struggles with OCD and intrusive thoughts, and Green doesn't shy away from showing how messy and difficult that is.
Yeah, he really captures that feeling of being trapped in your own mind,
Right.
right? Like your thoughts are just spiraling and you can't seem to escape them.
Exactly. And there's this one scene where Azah reads a story that her best friend wrote, and she realizes that her friend sees her as a burden because of her mental illness.
Oh gosh, that's heartbreaking.
It is. But it's also so real, that fear of being too much for the people you love. It's a very real fear for a lot of people who are struggling with their mental health.
It's like that feeling that you're somehow broken or damaged and that you're going to push everyone away.
Exactly. And what I appreciate about how Green handles it is that he doesn't try to sugarcoat it or offer easy solutions. He just lets that raw feeling exist, and he acknowledges how valid it is.
Yeah, and that honesty can be so powerful because it shows readers that they're not alone in feeling that way.
Right. It validates their experience, and it opens up the possibility for healing and connection.
It's like even in the midst of all that pain and darkness, there's still hope. And that's a really important message to convey, especially when you're dealing with something as sensitive as mental health.
Couldn't agree more. That authenticity, that willingness to show the less glamorous side of mental illness, it's crucial to fostering that sense of buy-in we were talking about earlier, that belief that recovery is possible.
Right, because if we only show the sanitized after-school special version of mental illness, it can make people feel even more isolated and misunderstood. Like their experience doesn't fit the narrative, so there must be something wrong with them.
Exactly. And I think that's where the essay's point about depressive realism comes in. Have you ever heard of that?
I don't think so. What is that?
It's the idea that sometimes people with depression actually have a more accurate perception of certain realities. It's not that they're being negative or pessimistic, it's that they're seeing things more clearly.
That's really interesting. I never thought about it that way before.
It's a bit of a mind bender, right? But it's something to keep in mind, not just in storytelling, but also in how we interact with people who are struggling. Because if we just dismiss their perceptions as being like, oh, you're just being negative, we risk further alienating them and discouraging them from seeking help.
So it's about validating their experience, even if it's painful or uncomfortable.
Exactly. It's about meeting them where they are and saying, hey, what you're feeling is real, and it's okay to feel that way, and we're here to support you.
I love that. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of authenticity, but how do you balance that with, like, telling a good story? Because sometimes the things that make for a gripping narrative, like dramatic twists and heightened emotions, those things don't always reflect the reality of living with mental illness. The essay brings up this idea of the good story problem.
Yes. Such a great way to put it. It's this constant tension that writers face. How do you tell a story that's engaging and entertaining without falling into harmful tropes or oversimplifying the complexities of mental health?
It's a tough one, for sure. The essay mentions all the bright places in my heart and other black holes as examples of books that, while they have compelling characters and those big emotional moments, they might not fully capture the day-to-day reality of living with mental illness. What are your thoughts on that?
It's like anything else, there's a spectrum, right? Some stories lean more into the Hollywood version of mental illness, while others strive for a more nuanced and realistic portrayal. And I think there's room for both, as long as we're aware of the potential impact and we're having these conversations about what those portrayals are communicating.
So true. Have you ever noticed how certain aspects of mental illness get, like, romanticized or exaggerated in fiction? What impact do you think that has on people?
Oh, absolutely. Like the whole tortured genius trope is a classic example. That character who's brilliant but troubled, and their mental illness is somehow the source of their unique abilities. It makes for an interesting story, but it can also send a really dangerous message, especially to young people who are still figuring themselves out.
It's like it glamorizes mental illness and makes it seem desirable, which is so far from the truth.
Right. It's like, oh, I wish I had anxiety, then I'd be super creative and insightful, but that's not how it works. Mental illness is a serious condition that requires care and support, not romanticization.
The essay calls out Sherlock and Split for this. Like,
Yeah.
Sherlock's almost superhuman deduction skills are tied to his lack of empathy, which is play off as this quirky, almost desirable trait.
Yeah, and then in Split, dissociative identity disorder is portrayed in this really sensationalized and violent way, which just reinforces harmful stereotypes about a really complex condition.
And those portrayals have real-world consequences, right?
Yeah.
They can make it harder for people to understand and empathize with those who are actually struggling.
Absolutely. It's like we're creating this distorted funhouse mirror reflection of mental illness instead of showing the nuanced reality.
Exactly. And that can make it even harder for people to reach out for help when they need it.
Because they might feel like their experience doesn't fit the mold, or they might be afraid of being judged or misunderstood.
Right. And that's why it's so important to have these conversations,
Yeah.
to unpack these portrayals and talk about how they're shaping our understanding of mental illness.
Because the way we tell stories about mental illness matters. It can have a real impact on how we perceive and treat each other.
Okay, so shifting gears a bit, the essay also brings up another layer of complexity: the impact of interactive media.
Ooh, interesting.
Yeah, it specifically uses the game Life is Strange as an example. Have you ever played that?
I've heard of it, but I haven't had a chance to play it yet. What's it about?
Okay, so it's this really emotionally charged game where you play as this teenage girl who discovers she has the power to rewind time.
Whoa, that sounds intense.
It is. And there's this one scene where you have to prevent a character from committing suicide. And the way the game mechanics work, you can't actually rewind your choices in that particular scene.
Oh, wow. So it really puts the weight of that decision on the player.
Exactly. And it can evoke all these really intense feelings of responsibility, guilt, even like a sense of helplessness.
I can see how that would be really powerful and potentially triggering for some players.
Right. And the essay points out how this kind of interactive storytelling can be both, like eye-opening and potentially problematic.
In what way?
Well, on one hand, it can cultivate empathy and understanding for people who might not have personal experience with mental health challenges. Like, putting you in that situation, even if it's just a game, can give you a glimpse into what it might feel like to be in that kind of crisis.
Yeah, that makes sense. But what's the problematic side?
The essay calls it the boss problem. It's this idea that mental illness gets reduced to a challenge that you can overcome through specific actions or choices. Like, if you just do the right thing or say the right words, you can fix the problem.
Ah, I see. So it's oversimplifying a really complex and nuanced process.
Exactly. It's like there's a magic formula for recovery, which we know isn't how it works in real life.
Mental illness isn't a video game, right? There's no reset button or cheat code. It's an ongoing journey with ups and downs, setbacks, and breakthroughs.
So true. Okay, so this brings us back to the central question of the essay, and it's a big one. How do we tell good stories about mental illness?
Right. Like, is there even a right way to do it?
Well, the essay doesn't give us a definitive answer, which kind of makes sense because there's no one-size-fits-all approach to something as complex as mental illness.
It's more about being mindful of the potential impact our stories can have and approaching these topics with sensitivity and respect.
Exactly. And I think the most important takeaway is that this is an ongoing conversation.
We're all learning and evolving, and we need to be open to different perspectives and experiences.
And that's why it's so crucial to center the voices of people with lived experience, to listen to their stories, learn from their perspectives, and let those insights guide our storytelling.
Because they're the ones who know what it's really like to navigate the world with mental illness.
And their stories deserve to be heard and respected.
Absolutely. It's a lot to think about. Like, how do we balance the need for compelling storytelling with the responsibility to portray mental illness in a way that's both authentic and sensitive?
Right. And the author even brings up this example from New Zealand. They have media guidelines for reporting on suicide.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and apparently there's evidence that even neutral news reports about suicide can inadvertently normalize it as a coping mechanism. It's kind of like what we were talking about earlier. Even when we have good intentions, our words can have unintended consequences.
That's a really sobering thought. It just highlights how much care and consideration we need to bring to these conversations.
Absolutely. So where do we go from here? I mean, the essay doesn't exactly give us a clear-cut answer on how to write good stories about mental illness.
True. There's no magic formula. But I think it does offer some really valuable food for thought. What are some of the things that really stuck with you from this deep dive?
I think for me, it's that reminder that there's no one-size-fits-all approach to mental illness, both in real life and in storytelling. What might resonate with one person could be harmful to another.
Yeah, and it's about recognizing that every story, every character, every depiction of mental illness is going to be unique. There's no single narrative that captures the full spectrum of experiences.
You know, it's interesting. The essay's author is a trained youth counselor, so you'd think he'd have all the answers, right?
Yeah.
But he actually admits that even he doesn't. And I found that really refreshing because it just shows how much we're all still learning and growing in our understanding of mental health.
It's a journey, not a destination.
Exactly. It's an ongoing conversation.
And I think that's why it's so important to center the voices of people with lived experience, to listen to their stories, learn from their perspectives, and let those insights guide our storytelling.
Because ultimately, it's about more than just telling good stories. It's about using our voices to create a more compassionate and understanding world.
A world where people feel safe and supported in seeking help when they need it.
Yes. And a world where mental illness isn't stigmatized or misunderstood. You know, there's this one line from the essay that really resonated with me. The author says, "All I can hope to do is write consciously, in hopes that someone struggling will find some meaning in this world, so often full of darkness and despair."
That's beautiful. And it speaks to the power of storytelling, right? To offer hope, connection, and a sense of shared humanity.
Exactly. And I think that's a powerful message to carry with us as we continue exploring the complexities of mental illness in fiction and in real life.
Absolutely. It's a responsibility we all share, whether we're writers, artists, journalists, or simply engaged citizens.
Well said. Well, this deep dive has been incredibly thought-provoking, and I want to thank you for joining me in this conversation.
It's been a pleasure.
To all our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep exploring this topic, to challenge the narratives you encounter, and continue the conversation about mental health in your own communities. Until next time, take care.